Annus Mirabilis by Philip Larkin. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Up to then there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for the ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then all at once, the quarrel sank, everyone felt the same, and every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Over the following couple minutes, I will give a quick analysis of Annus Mirabilis by Philip Larkin, by looking at its social and historical context, its tone and mood, its language, and its form and structure. So, I'm going to start with the social and historical context. When in the first stanza he says, in 1963, which was rather late for me, this is added by Larkin, especially in the parentheses, to jokingly add that he is out of his prime, although this has a very somber undertone, stating that, as in all Larkin poems, it's quite sad. Also in the first stanza is the line, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. As the poem states, its conception is directly between these two events. The Chatterley ban refers to the novel Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was found not guilty after having been tried for vulgarity under the Obscene Publications Act of 1959. This opened the floodgates to sexual freedom in literature in the United Kingdom on the 2nd of November 1960. And on the other side is the Beatles released their first LP record in the form of the mono version of Please Please Me in March of 1963. However, Larkin is probably referring to the Beatles' first, which was in fact their second record and was released in June of 1964. This would place 1963 directly between these two events. Now I will speak about the tone and mood in the poem. So, here I add a question mark to elucidate that although from what we can read in some of the lines, such as life was never better in 1963, it seems relatively jubilant. However, there is an obvious underlying notion of somberness, especially in lines such as his parentheses, rather late for me, which is another jibe at his old age, or in his mind, the old age of 41. And especially in these two lines, a shame that spread to everything, and unlosable game. So, today in our sexually free age, where it doesn't matter if you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transsexual, let alone have premarital sex, this seemed extremely out of place to Larkin, that people should feel so incredibly against sex. And unlosable game, once again, is happy with underlying somberness, because obviously everybody would love to play an unlosable game. However, underlyingly, it's like eternal life, which would, in fact, be hell, because imagine living forever, seeing your friends and family die, and never getting older. It would be terrible. So now I will talk about the form and structure in this poem. The poem in all of the stanzas follow an A-B-B-A-B rhyme scheme, which is rather strange for a Larkin poem, because generally he likes to mix up the rhyme scheme a little bit. And there are 4 stanzas, each of 5 lines, so it's a relatively short poem. And lastly, I will talk about the language in the poem. Halfway through the poem, it changes from embarrassment to sudden sexual freedom, and it's a rather bumpy transition between the two. And then there's also an unsubtle underlying crassness, which I think is rather Larkin-esque, such as the very first line of the poem is "sexual intercourse began." This is almost like, as sexual intercourse began, the poem began, life began, everything became clear, everything began. And lastly, I'd like to discuss alliteration, because this is a trait that Larkin uses in many of his poems to fortify or strengthen many lines. So here I picked 2 that show his strengthening of the embarrassment of the public towards sex, and lastly I've picked one which shows his happiness. So, shame that started at 16. You can hear the alliteration in this, and alliteration with an S is called sibilance. It's the continuation of the S consonant. And this, as well as the wrangle for the ring, kind of strengthens the thought of hopelessness or embarrassment towards it. With wrangle for the ring obviously meaning that people cannot wait to get married, because that's the only time where they're allowed to have sex. And also the happiness that couples and marriage is thought to bring. And finally, a brilliant breaking of the bank. The triple B sound reinforces the happiness and the excitement towards sexual freedom. Thank you very much for listening.